Welcome to lecture number 11, Incident Handling. So typical agenda that we'll be covering. First I'll summarize the last lecture and chapter. Then I'll get into what the objectives of this particular chapter and lecture are. Then I'll get into the lecture itself and I'll summarize and conclude with some review questions. So in the last lecture what we did is we started to get into bash shell scripting and we learned how to write basic shell scripts. And we talked about how shell scripts are very valuable in terms of automating particular tasks within an environment that systems administrators typically operate in. And we talked about some of the common programming elements such as variables and loops and so on. We talked about how to handle user interaction. So for example, if we wanted to put in particular user input into the command line for a particular script, we can go ahead and do that, and the script will generate outputs based off of the different commands that we put in there, the variables that we've defined, the loops that we've put together, the conditional statements that we've defined, and so on. And we've also talked about how to parse and manipulate text files. And so really all of those types of tasks are trying to get at the types of tasks that systems administrators typically do when they are trying to maintain the information security of a particular organization and ensure this confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information assets, and employ the appropriate controls such that the threats that are coming into an organization that are targeting specific vulnerabilities are mitigated appropriately. What we're going to do now for this lecture and for the remainder of the class is step away a little bit from the technical component of the class and start to get into more of the managerial component. So what we're going to be focused on is identifying the major components of dealing with what are called incidents. We'll understand the incident handling life cycle, prepare a basic policy outlining the methodology for handling an incident, report on the incident to improve preparation for a similar incident in the future, and the elements of disaster recovery and business continuity planning. So let's go ahead and recall the information security model. Remember that we've got assets, vulnerabilities, threats, and controls. So we've got information assets that are stored within a particular IT system, and that IT system typically has a set of vulnerabilities associated with it because every technology, every system has a vulnerability or set of vulnerabilities associated with it. Now, what we want to do is go ahead and employ the appropriate security controls such as access control lists, intrusion detection systems, firewall rules, and so on and so forth, such that the threats that are coming into an organization, malware, ransomware, the keyloggers, zero-day exploits, those security controls will block those threats appropriately. But the question is, can we stop all of the attacks? And the answer to that is probably not. There's going to be some attacks that come through. And this is just an unfortunate reality of many of the security incidents that we see today. So how do we handle these incidents? So every time an attack comes through and it's successful in some way, shape, or form, how do we actually handle these incidents? And moreover, how do we analyze these incidents to prevent future incidents from occurring? Now, the definition of an incident is a violation or imminent threat of violation of computer security policies, acceptable use of policies, or standard security practices. And some examples of incidents include denial of service attack that causes a web server to crash. So the threat is a denial of service. The IT system is the web server, and the information asset could be the web pages that are hosted on that particular web server. The malware installed from a phishing attack infects user computers and establishes connections with an external host. An attacker obtains sensitive data and demands ransom from your CEO to prevent release. Sensitive information from your company is being disseminated through peer-to-peer file sharing services. So these are all examples of incidents that may have occurred on your particular network. And ideally, incidents would not happen if we had infinite security budgets and infinitely capable security personnel. However, in the real world, we don't have these types of things. We don't have an infinite security budget, and we don't have infinitely capable security personnel. Things can go wrong in spite of your best attempts, and we call these things incidents. And it's useful to develop standard procedures to respond to incidents, because incidents will happen, and that's just an unfortunate truth of what we're dealing with within the information security realm. And we want to refine these procedures based on the experiences, and typical business processes have improvement exercises associated with them. So incident handling, the overall process is similar for most incidents, and there's going to be minor incident-specific variations, and these variations may also be based off of the business processes that you have within your organization. So incident response that you may have within a hospital may be different between that and a bank. But in general, what you can find for incident handle can be described in NIST 800-61 revision point 2. There's going to be 4 general steps: preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication, recovery, and post-incident analysis. And you can see a general diagram right here. So there's going to be preparation right here. Then we're going to go into the detection and analysis, and that's going to feed into the containment, eradication, and recovery, and that's going to feed back to the detection and analysis. So that's going to go ahead and create a loop right here where this is going to repeat until you get to the post-incident activity. And that information that's produced from the post-incident activity is actually fed back into the preparation for future incidents. And we'll talk about each of these steps in the future slides. So with preparation, it's the first step for creating an incident response plan. It's not an enumeration process. So listing all possible threat scenarios and the appropriate response to each of these scenarios. It's more productive. Identify the basic steps common to all events. So we're not enumerating all of the possible threat scenarios. The reason for that is that that's very, very time consuming and so on. Instead, you want to what's called abstract and identify the basic steps common to all events and plan an execution for each of these steps. So therefore, you have one common mechanism to actually prepare and execute a set of steps associated with many different types of incidents. Incident preparation components, there's peacetime activities, so incident response policy, incident response team, supporting the team, incident communication, compliance, hardware and software, and training. So with the incident response policy, it's a description of standard methods used by an organization for handling information security incidents. And the benefits of a policy, it helps focus on the incident as a whole from start to finish, without getting diverted by media and organizational pressures. Discussions provide management with understanding of the issues that they may have to deal with during an actual incident. So it's a form of communication with management. And impacts of plan controls can be assessed by stakeholders and may not be anticipated by the IT team. So it's a reassurance for users as well. Now, within organizations, especially large organizations, there's going to be what are called incident response teams. So there's going to be entire teams that have varying levels of expertise in different aspects of information security and for different systems that can help you respond to incidents accordingly. So these are staff that are designated to respond to incidents. And they develop experience over time about expectations of an organization during incidents. It's often cross-departmental. So managers have to spare IRT members when needed. The responsibilities include quickly identifying threats to campus data infrastructure, assessing the level of risk, taking the immediate steps to mitigate risk, notifying management of the event and associated risk, notifying local personnel of any incident involving their resources, issuing a final report as needed, including lessons learned. And the roles of each incident response team must be part of their incident response policy. So in the policy, you define what are the roles of each member of an IRT. And a large organization may need multiple IRTs, one within each division of an organization, and a central group decided when events start crossing boundaries of the affected division. So the incident response team composition, say you're within an organization that's currently without an incident response team, typically what you'll see within an incident response team is that the IRT will have one chair, usually a senior security analyst. And this senior security analyst will coordinate with external stakeholders and they'll help other IRT members perform their functions. They need to have a high level of credibility within the organization for competence, excellent communication skills, both in terms of oral and in writing, so they need to be able to communicate with different technical members of their team, as well as management that may not be as technical that they need to actually derive resources from. So they need to have enough technical background to understand the situation and judgment to make split-second educated decisions based off of status updates. Now, one of the key things about incident response teams is that they don't necessarily work 8 to 5 jobs. Often, many times, many of my friends who are actually incident response handlers or they're part of an incident response team, they're on call. They're going to be working 24/7. It's not uncommon for them to get calls, say, at 2 a.m. and say, hey, we got a situation that's going down over here at the organization. We got these types of attacks that we're seeing. We got these types of phishing emails and so on and so forth. So incident response teams, the leaders need to be able to make split-second educated decisions based off of the status updates that they're getting on from their team. And this often is done in a very real-time fashion. Technical members of an IRT are selected depending on the threat action. So for example, if an Oracle database was breached due to a compromised administrator account on the OS, then the IRT may include the following members: a person familiar with the operating system, a database administrator, a network engineer, and desktop services. And each of them will provide valuable expertise and input such that they can mitigate that particular incident if it's appropriate and learn from it and prepare themselves for a future incident that may occur that's similar to the one that they experienced. So the IRT interacts with a multitude of stakeholders. So we have the IRT team right here. They're going to interact with the other incident response teams, both within an organization and across the organization, internet service providers, the ISPs, incident reporters, law enforcement agencies, software and support vendors, and customers, constituents, and media. So the supporting team, communication is an important aspect for the duties of an IRT. As I mentioned, they often work in a very real-time type of environment. So you want to make sure that the communication between team members is absolutely important. And that's something that I actually test within this class, and you may not have noticed this, is that within your emails that you send me, I ask you to list out the course title, ISM 6328, in the title of your email. And the communication that I try to have with you on a day-to-day basis and through email tends to be very quick. I try to be as quick as possible, and my TAs try to be as quick as possible as well. And the reason for this is that there's different pieces of information that you all are asking for, and there's different interests and needs that you all need. So there needs to be a mechanism for me to communicate with you very effectively, very quickly, and that's why the TAs are providing that technical support. I provide some more of the high-level support and so on and so forth. And so the communication is extremely important within an IRT. And they must resist the temptation of conveying speculation as an informed expert opinion. They only provide a need-to-know principle. So people are provided only the information necessary to perform their job. So I will provide you the information that's needed in order to perform your particular job as a student. When communicating with the media, the supporting team is advisable. So the media relations has the know-how and expertise on how to deal with the media. Legal counsel can verify federal or state disclosure laws, and law enforcement for government cover and credibility. Now, where this becomes important is that, say, there are certain industries that have to have some sort of a disclosure policy in place. In case they get breached, how do they actually disseminate that information to key stakeholders? How do they relay that to the media, legal counsel, law enforcement, and so on? And the IRT should really minimize rumor mongering, because that could significantly harm the way that an organization is viewed. Incident communications, you can really break it down into inbound and outbound communications. Inbound is information about the occurrence of an incident, and the outbound is notifications to affected people. So inbound, we've got these reports, the direct, anonymous, help desk, self-audit, and so on, that comes into the IRT. Outbound will be the type of information that's shared with the IT personnel, management, end users, compliance-related media, and so on. Inbound communications are like the direct reports, so the asset owner or custodian may report the incident. The anonymous report, web forms to report an issue anonymously without fear of reprisal. The help desk, the problem resolution may real problems, so for example, misconfigured shared network drives and so on, self-audits, and so on. Outbound communications, affected people are curious, so the people who are affected will want to know accordingly. IT personnel and IT help desk. So users quickly overwhelm the help desk when essential assets are affected. And immediate updates to remove exploited vulnerability. Inform managers and other executives periodically, even if nothing has changed. So prevents distracting phone calls to engineers working on containment and eradication of the problem. So quick text messages and email messages with status updates are adequate. And end users and customers, they tend to get very edgy when they don't know what's going on. And they typically tend to have two types of questions. When will the system be back? And what happened? What exactly happened? So managing these communications is absolutely critical for an IRT team based off of their expertise and the input information that they're getting from various sources. Now, compliance is the act of following applicable laws, regulations, rules, industry codes, and contractual obligations. So this is important for an IRT to know because they need to have the appropriate compliance to whatever industry that they're in. They need to be able to follow any of the laws and regulations that are associated with the particular organization and industries. And ideally, these are best practices that are developed to avoid well-known past mistakes. In practice, often important because mainly non-compliance leads to avoidable penalties. So if you comply, you're going to be able to avoid a lot of these penalties that are set up if you don't comply. So you need to comply with the IRT requirements that are applicable to your context. So for example, there's something called the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, and it requires federal agencies to establish incident response capabilities. Each federal civilian agency must designate a primary and secondary point of contact with the U.S. CERT. So this is actually required. And the United States Computer Emergency Readiness Team designates this, which is the U.S. CERT. So report all incidents consistent with the agency's incident response policy. If federal civilian agencies do not comply with this, then they will be hit with penalties. So the IRT needs to be aware of these different types of policies that are associated with their organization or industry such that they apply the appropriate mechanisms that are needed and they avoid any penalties that are associated with non-compliance. So when known or suspected loss, theft of or compromise of personally identifiable information involving U.S. Navy systems occurs, the Department of Navy is required to use this particular form, OPNAV form 5211/13, to make initial and follow-up reports, send the U.S. CERT within 1 hour of discovering the breach has occurred, report to the DON-CIO Privacy Office within 1 hour, report to the Defense Privacy Office, and report to the Navy USMC BUMED chain of command as applicable. So they must follow these particular set of steps. And these sets of steps are predefined and actually reduces the amount of overhead that a incident response team actually has to deal with. If these steps are in place and the incident response team knows what they need to do, then that actually becomes a lot more manageable. So once an incident comes in, they're able to execute these particular steps in a way that will make sure that they're compliant, they've been tested, they've been done through experience, and so on. To be effective, an IRT doesn't necessarily also just need a set of policies. They also need the appropriate tools. They need appropriate hardware and software. And some of the hardware and software recommended by 861 Revision 2 for incident response includes backup devices, laptops for gathering, analyzing, or writing reports, spare computer hardware, so for crash and burn purposes. So we talked about backups and hot spares and cold spares and that type of thing. So different computer hardware that you could actually go ahead install back into the machines, but more importantly be able to extract out other payload and malware that's considered to be unknown. Packet analyzers, digital forensic software, and evidence gathering accessories such as digital cameras, audio recorders, chain of custody forms, and so on. Search engines are very useful, so log snippets or FTP banners may reveal valuable information such as location of log files, configuration files, and other important clues. And it helps the security team build a more complete timeline of the event. When did the event actually occur? What was the event? What were the mechanisms in the event? what are the steps that we can use in the future to prevent these events from happening? So we've got the policies that will help you communicate the event, right? But then what we've also got is the hardware and software that will enable an IRT team to actually perform their task. Most importantly, they need to have some training. The IRT team needs to have some form of training. This training is awareness of a baseline set of information on all aspects of security, such as access control, telecommunications network security, information security governance, software development cryptography, security architecture and design, security operations, business continuity, discovery, recovery planning, which we've got an entire course on that, legal regulations, investigations and compliance, and physical or environmental security. And I can't cover all of this within this particular class. This is just more to introduce you to the fundamental concepts of information security. But an IRT team should have these types of baseline information on these types of information security aspects such that they can create a holistic team to address any sort of incident that comes into their organization. Now, a key thing that incident response teams need to be able to do is detect and analyze. So they need to be able to document, detect, and analyze the incidents that have actually occurred. We're going to go over an overview of that in this particular chapter, but the details, the significant details, are actually going to be in the next chapter. So incident documentation. Once an incident has actually occurred, it needs to be documented appropriately. What exactly happened? So what NIST recommends is for minimal information. So current status of the incident, new, in progress, forwarded for investigation, resolved. So having these types of status updates, a summary of the incident, indicators related to the incident. So what are some of the indicators that came up? Were there malicious files that started to pop up in certain locations, certain directories across machines? Other incidents related to this incident, actions taken by all incident handlers on this incident, chain of custody if that's applicable, impact assessments related to the incident, contact information for involved parties, so for example the system owners, system administrators, and so on, list of evidence gathered during the incident investigation, comments from the incident handlers, and the next steps which need to be taken. So do we need to rebuild a host? Do we need to upgrade an application? Do we need to improve password privacy policies? You know, that type of thing. Detection methods include visible changes to the services. So how do you actually detect an incident has occurred? The way that you can detect is, say, visible changes to the services. So the most explicit one you can think of is like website defaced. Your website has been defaced by somebody else. Performance monitoring, excessively slow computer performance. Is your computer performing excessively slow? Is it very, very slow? Are there different resources that you've seen that are running that you've not seen before? These could be all telltale signs that it's been used as a bot, or there's some sort of virus on there, and so on. PII monitoring, so being able to go on Google and seeing any sort of alerts that are coming up about your personally identifiable information. And today there's people that are so-called monitoring the dark web that can actually start to look for credit card information and so on. And let me know if you're actually interested in having the capability to look for your credit card information on the dark web. I've actually developed a system that will allow people to go in and identify whether or not their cards are stolen and available on the dark web. File integrity monitoring, so for example, host-based IDS tools. Anonymous reporting, so have people anonymously reported that an attack has actually occurred. Log analysis, which we'll get into in the next lecture. Endpoint protection alerts, so for example, malware protection, host IDS functionality, internal investigations, and others. Now, once you've detected that a particular incident has occurred or is occurring, you want to go ahead and analyze it accordingly. So discover all adverse events that compose the incident. What are all of the events that are actually composing of that incident? Manage the next phases of the cycle, so containment and eradication. You want to avoid containment without analysis. Then you want to search, the internet search engines can be very, very helpful during this process. So once you've gone ahead and identified the different types of banners and so on, what you can do is that you can start to search the internet to see if there's been similar attacks that have occurred within your industry and across industries as well. Identify the stakeholders that need to know, and then identify the restricted or essential assets that are affected by the incident. Remember, the goal is to protect our information assets from being harmed. So incident analysis is being able to analyze not only what the incident is, but how it affects the information assets, whether the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of these assets have been compromised in any way, shape, or form. And so after you've analyzed it, you want to make sure that you are containing, eradicating, and recovering the incident accordingly. So containment is the act of preventing the expansion of harm. Typically involves disconnecting affected computers from the network. So there may involve some temporary shutdown of services. So you're taking that particular machine that has been affected offline for a period of time until you've contained that particular source of malware and so on. Sometimes containment is necessary before the analysis is completed. So you want to make sure that that machine has been contained in a way that that it doesn't spread across to different machines within an organization. And if the analyst is confident that the ongoing events merit action and or determines that the risk to assets is too high for events to continue, then you want to go ahead and contain it accordingly. And the containment is largely determined by the experience of the IRT members, along with input from management if possible. So for example, if a backdoor is being used to actively transfer PII to off-campus hosts, exfiltration, the network connection should be broken as soon as possible. So you want to contain that particular area, that particular network connection that's exfiltrating the data accordingly. So thereafter, the backdoor can be handled. So through network ACLs, firewalls, and or actual removal of the backdoor on the server. It's important to get stakeholder input to the extent possible. So prevents other incidents from occurring. You disconnect HR systems to remove malware, for example. It may interrupt the payroll processes if it's performed at the wrong time. Say, so during tax season, for example, right? You want to make sure that you get the stakeholders' input to the extent that you can and say, hey, these systems are going to be offline because of these reasons, and you want to make sure that you have not only their approval, but they know that what's going on. And other judgment calls are required during the containment. So do you actually want to sit back and observe the hacker behavior? And this is something you want to do in the case of a honeypot, a vulnerable system that you've created that's vulnerable on purpose, so you can monitor hacker behavior and see what the different types of actions that they're performing on the system are. So you need to have the ability to judge the potential amount of damage to assets from delayed containment. So these are the different types of things that an incident response team needs to have jurisdiction over and the knowledge to handle accordingly. So IRT members and administrators have to be very careful when pulling the plug on hackers. So when the hackers detect that they have actually been detected, they can get very destructive. So they may be like, hey, I'm just going to go ahead and destroy as much as possible. So they may remove all of the logging information that may lead to their capture. The database administrators may set up traps to totally destroy the database and contain data, and so on. So the hackers can get very, very destructive. And the FBI actually conducts sting operations against hackers. So they'll forcibly and speedily remove individuals from keyboards and other input devices. This minimizes that hackers might initiate scripts to destroy assets and evidence. So for example, the Finale and Kingpin, Max Butler case example, and so on. So the timeline that you can see is that there is containment, eradication, there's also more eradication and recovery if possible. And this all forms the incident analysis timeline. Now, after the incident has been resolved accordingly, you want to make sure that there's post-incident analysis. What exactly happened? So the IRT members will gather their notes and finalize their documentation. The documentation should contain all individual adverse events involved in the incident. So together with timestamps and assets involved, as well as indicate areas of the organization involved in the accident and resulting breach. How the threats were handled individually by each department and together under the coordination of the IRT. The extent to which procedures were appropriate to handle the issues. So what you had a set of procedures that were in place beforehand to handle incidents. Were those procedures actually appropriate for the context that you were in, for the context that you were actually witnessing? The opportunities for improvement, the extent to which assets were appropriately identified and classified, the extent to which information sharing and stakeholders were done satisfactorily, and so on. Most importantly, you want to make sure that you document and you're aware of the technical measures necessary to avoid similar issues in the future. although we can't block all of these cyber attacks that could come into an organization, we can learn from them. We should learn from them such that we are able to deploy the appropriate controls and make sure that we are protecting ourselves from similar attacks to occur in the future. So fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice is really shame on me. We want to learn and deploy the appropriate controls as necessary. Now, getting into disasters, it's a calamitous incident that causes great destruction. So disaster is not just limited to a particular cyber attack. It could be, say, a flood comes in, or in the case of Florida, a hurricane comes in. It has a huge repercussions throughout the entire organization and involves multiple sub-incidents. So disaster recovery, the process adopted by the IT organizations to bring the systems back up. And the primary objective is to keep employees and their families safe. And implementation should avoid hazardous situations. This is really important for incident response teams to be aware of disaster recovery and business continuity processes. And this is something that's actually offered in a class within the Masters of Cybersecurity that you can actually take about business continuity and disaster recovery. So, for example, there's a disaster that happened a while ago at USF in 2002, which a hardware failure caused all 30,000 student email accounts to be lost. And disaster recovery called for a plan to recreate all student email accounts. Initially, they were empty, but would allow students to start sending and receiving emails. And subsequently, all mailbox data was extracted from tape and restored to the user's mailbox. So the entire disaster recovery process took about 3 weeks. So that was a disaster that had multiple sub-impacts associated with it. And disaster recovery is part of a bigger picture called business continuity planning. Business continuity planning is the process of maintaining operations under adverse conditions. We can't just shut down the entire business because a particular disaster occurred. We need to be able to make sure that the business has appropriate continuity such that it can continue to move forward and so on. The planners contemplate what would happen in the case of a disaster, what would be minimally necessary to help the organization continue and operate in a case of a disaster. So in the case of the USF emails, continuity activities involved questions how students would turn in assignments. BCP and DR involve and are often led by entities other than IT. So it goes beyond IT and goes into business processes as a whole. So HR may require all individuals to stay at home in a hurricane at level 4 or higher. IT may need employees to be physically present to shut down machines, and coordination between these groups will help ensure that the appropriate mechanisms and appropriate actions are being taken into place. And that's where communications really become critically important. Continuing on with disaster, there's also something called business impact analysis, which is an important part of BCP. Identify the services and products that are critical to an organization. And the BIA is related to asset management. Essential assets that directly support the services and products that result from the BIA. So the incident response team needs to be aware of these types of things such that they're able to communicate with the business processes or the people that are setting the business processes so they can maintain ongoing continuity of the different types of activities that happen within an organization such that the organization can continue to function while a recovery plan is being put into place. And a preliminary DR checklist could be call list, plans to inform fellow employees if the phone systems are down, plans to sync backups and recovery, and so on. And you can think about this almost like a hurricane checklist as well. So what are the different types of things that you need to be aware of, as well as what are the steps that can be taken into account or used to help ensure that the disaster recovery goes according to plan and is as smooth and seamless as possible. In all likelihood, if you go into this type of area within your career, you're not going to get these disaster recovery responsibilities in the early part of your career. And so it's not covered in detail in the book, but it's important to introduce and familiarize with some of the basic concepts. And it enables you to contribute to the process as needed. So in case you do get into some situations where you need to do business recovery or business continuity and disaster recovery, you will be aware of them accordingly. And like I said, there's an entire course dedicated in the Masters of Cybersecurity program for business continuity and disaster recovery. So So to summarize, what we did is we talked about the different components of dealing with an incident. We motivated this particular lecture by talking about that, incidents, they're unavoidable. They are going to happen. If we had infinite security budgets, then we'd be able to get into accordingly and be able to deploy all the controls that we really want to deploy. However, that's just simply not the case. So we got into understanding that incidents will occur, and we need to understand the major components of how to deal with an incident. We started to understand the incident handling lifecycle, so the preparation and being able to analyze the incident and so on. We talked about preparing a basic policy outlining the methodology for handling an incident. Who do you communicate with? What type of information do you take into account? And so on and so forth. You want to report how to report on the incident to improve preparation for a similar incident in the future. Although we can't prevent all incidents from occurring, we need to be able to report on it to media relations, document it appropriately, be able to come up with the appropriate controls such that we prevent such attacks from occurring in the future. And we also talked about the basic elements of disaster recovery and business continuity planning. We talked about how the major components are, we want to talk with the stakeholders within an organization. We want to have mechanisms in place such that the business continues to offer value and conduct its basic operations such that the business doesn't go out of business. So a full list of review questions can be found at the end of chapter 11. And the key thing here is that, just understand the basic fundamentals. There's not, specific guidelines that I can provide for each and every specific organization and situation. But what I can do is that what I have done is I've provided the overarching, guidelines that you can consider when you're doing incident response. And chapter 11 will help test your knowledge and give you more additional information about each of the steps that I detailed in this particular lecture. As always, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks.